Hello and welcome back after our winter break to the Institute's Colloquium. This is the first colloquium we're having in 2023, and we're very excited to welcome Professor Alexis de Greiff to present his research today. Professor de Greiff has a background in theoretical physics, both at the BA and the MSc level. And he did his PhD in history of science at Imperial College in London. He is an associate professor of the history of science and technology at the National University of Colombia, and currently a visiting researcher here at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science at Department 3. His book, The Doors of the Defeated Universe, through empirical historical research on theoretical physics, was an award-winning publication. It won the Latin American Society of Science, Technology, and Society Amilcar Herrera Prize. He is currently working on not one but two projects. What he's working on now is the history of the role of artifacts and knowledge produced, used, and developed by the contenders of the Colombian internal war between state and revolutionary groups. So this is what we'll hear in more detail shortly. And he's also coordinating an interdisciplinary group at the National University of Colombia concerned with democracy, public history, and civic education. And without further ado, I will invite Professor de Greiff to give his talk. Thank you.
Dabeiba, August 2017. A little town in the Urabá region, near the Caribbean border between Colombia and Panama. Yesenia and Jenny, two women who for over 18 years had been combatants of the 34th Front of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, FARC, now are 34 and 36. Both came from peasant families who had suffered a long and bloody war. For many years, it was mainly a women's job, says Yesenia. But then, men and women have the same responsibilities and jobs. And that has to do also with cooking. There are many techniques, she goes on. At the beginning, it was very primitive, though. A campfire and a pot hung on a spit. But then we modernized. Vietnamese ovens and Chinese ovens appeared. The Vietnamese are so that the enemy can't see you because the flame is hidden and there is no smoke. Before, the smoke was no problem. But then the enemy started air raids. If we were far from a civilian area, the army knew it was us. But making a Vietnamese oven is very easy. Really, very easy, you know. You make a hole in the ground and cover its top. Then you make two holes on top of it to put the pots there. Then you make a long chimney, but instead of going up, it runs just beneath the surface, covered with leaves and earth. It is about 50 meters long, so that the smoke can disperse. At the end, no smoke comes out, just a little vapor. All very easy, very easy. If there is a good piece of land, flat but a bit sloping, I'll do it for you in a few minutes. If the land doesn't have clay, the oven collapses, in which case you must put stones to support it. But not every stone will do it, though. You have to know which stones are good and which aren't. River stones, for example, are no good because they break in the heat and the kiln collapses. You have to use piedras bobas, dump stones, a very dry kind of stone. Those keep the oven up and warm. And then you can offer warm food to 80, 100, 200, whatever number of companions. You learn all that here in the FARC. Here we learn everything for a living. I don't remember who precisely taught me. A comrade, for sure. This is part of an interview I conducted with former, as I said, this is going to be the content and be telegraphical, of course. So, Dora, don't worry. First, I want to talk about the relevance and the motivations. Then, what is the project about? Then, why is it important? How? What is the system or the systems of irregular warfare? And I'll show an example with the Vietnamese stove, and then a few preliminary. So first, the motivations and the relevance. But let me make a short introduction to this war. The peace agreement between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the Colombian state put an end to 52 years of an armed confrontation between the oldest and largest revolutionary group of the hemisphere and the Colombian state. A war that produced more than 8 million victims, deaths, wounded, kidnapped, displaced, desaparecidos, women, children, men, LGTB+, civilians, militaries, guerrilleros. The largest armed conflict in the Americas by far. FARC emerged as a small peasant self-defense movement in 1965. Since 1982, when the FARC decided to take the power at a national level, its actions and number of combatants increased exponentially, arriving to have more than 17,000 fighters, 6 blocks constituted by 60 fronts, each of about 100 fighters. From a small guerrilla, then, it became a semi-professional army. Hence, the group's logistics became a challenge that forced them to produce a complex infrastructure governed by a bureaucratic apparatus. The FARC developed several techniques and artifacts for surviving, living, attacking, and defending in a range of extreme conditions. Indeed, this project proposes a different narrative of the Colombian conflict. Implementing infrastructure and technology for war is a complex operation that entails a robust and large logistical system. Rebels and militaries are hierarchical organizations with a social division of work, standardized doctrines, and strict disciplinary codes. War destroys, but it also builds infrastructures and technologies. There are experts in annihilating the enemy, as those devoted to make and use explosives. But there are also experts in building and administrating infrastructure, hospitals, and a health system. Create artifacts, and set up schools of guerrilla warfare. The infrastructures for war are used by all actors, including civilians, no matter of who constructed them and for what purpose. Indeed, infrastructures, as any boundary object, involve different knowledges and practices. So, the motivations. First, the political motivations. And they have to do with the current process in Colombia. Reconciliation, reincorporation, and non-repetition. An anchor for non-repetition, in my opinion, is to recognize, put in value, and document the knowledges and practices produced and used by the guerrillas, the militaries, and the civilians during the war. The process of reconciliation, on the other hand, need memory and documenting, which pave the way towards that kind of living together. The material culture of all the actors of the conflict is not that different, nor are the necessities. Therefore, the grassroots guerrilleros, the soldiers and the victims of the civil society, may find in the history of artifacts, knowledge, and actions a common ground to start conversations from a perspective that, without forgetting the horrors of war, allow to see the other as part of a larger community, one in which the insurgents are more than a destructive force, the militaries are more than a repressive body, and civilians are more than passive victims. In other words, the history of the material culture contributes, I think, to satisfy our necessity of identity. It's not about denying our identities as insurgents, militaries, or civilians, but to show through opening the window to new dimensions that we have many identities. We have then to dislocate the discourses of conflicts for the current ones, because the current ones perpetuate the friend-enemy dichotomy. The second, the historiographical relevance. I think it's a different narrative, proposing a different narrative of the so-called Cold War. The Cold War's technologies in use were not the nuclear arsenals, nor the bunkers, not even the James Bond's gadgets. The Cold War was, in practice, a hot, dirty, and old type of conflict. It took place mainly outside the US and Europe, affecting more than 70% of the world's population and 75% of the surface of the planet. Thus, the narrative of the Cold War as predominantly nuclear is just a part, a tiny part, and an Eurocentric and Euro-USA American narrative that ignores Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, China. In other words, it's a history. In other words, a history of the hot war contributes to a truly global history of the post-World War II era. From a theoretical point of view, the concept of irregular war should be put in question. Irregular in what sense? In its tactics, in its technologies, in its actors, in its structures, or in its institutions? Irregular wars are defined as those that are not fought between two regular armies. And I want to point out that then this definition is a negative one. It's a concept by opposition. Hence, irregular in war studies is normal in cultural studies. It refers to an Euro-US American centric view, quite narrow, ideological, by the way. Regular in this narrative were the Napoleonic Wars or the Franco-German War and the two world wars. That is thus not only a small fraction of war history in geographical terms, but also very short in time, just 2 centuries at the most. Furthermore, it ignores irregular wars fought by insurgents during the two world wars, like the partisans in Italy and France, Mao's actions, Ho Chi Minh's resistance against the Japanese occupation, not to mention the independence wars in the Americas. So, what about this idea of irregularity? Does that mean that irregular wars are essentially different from any other war? In other words, it assumes that there weren't any relevant processes of standardization on the side of insurgent groups from different latitudes. The case I'm going to present you today suggests that insurgent groups had a global network for technology transfer. Therefore, in their material culture, knowledge and actions was at some level standardized artifacts. Local conditions and traditions produced different styles, to bring Thomas Hughes' term. So, let me pass to the project. And the project is using the Colombian conflict, writing a global social history of irregular warfare in Latin America. And I want to underline social, is not military. It is thought as a book, or a book in 2 volumes. First volume will be on insurgency, using FARC and the ELN, Ejército de Liberación Nacional, as examples. And the second one on counterinsurgency is mainly the armed forces and the police. Questions. How do actors make decisions about managing resources and knowledge under the conditions of the Colombian internal military conflict? What is the role of technology in the construction of institutions in irregular wartime? What is the legacy of this war in technological and institutional practices? Is the Colombian case exceptional in relation to other irregular wars in the 20th century? What kind of global history is the irregular warfare? So now let me start with this quotation that we made a few years ago with my colleague Mauricio Nieto. It would be naive to think that the militaries lacked any interest in technoscience. Knowledge transfer and adaptation to local conditions must have occurred. Such transfer, both south-north and south-south, certainly entailed weapons, but also included infrastructure engineering. The other side of the conflict needs to be investigated too. We know almost nothing about innovation and new uses of technology in the insurgent forces. So, this is the analytical, and here I'm sure I will have a lot of comments and criticisms. That's the idea, I suppose. And this is what actually developed while I was here at the MPI. I start with this idea. In 1991, Chilean economist Manfred Max Neff introduced the model of human-scale development. The basic idea is that we have to differentiate between needs and satisfiers. The idea that needs are infinite is an invention of capitalism. Fundamental needs are very few, he says. But satisfiers, on the other hand, are multiple. Not going to explain this, but if you see, he proposes 9 different needs, fundamental needs, essential needs. And then we will have, or communities, develop different kinds of satisfiers. I'm not going to talk about the evaluation of those satisfiers. This is not a theory for investigating the past. This is a development theory. This was used in the 90s and still being used in some places to study development at a human scale. So I tried to show the idea with this sketch, with this graph. So we have fundamental necessities that he identifies are these ones: entertainment, leisure, comprehension, freedom, creation, affection, identity, protection, and subsistence. And then we have different kind of possible satisfiers. In terms of technology, if you like, we have different alternatives, several alternatives. So, for example, food is a satisfier. It's not a need itself. It is part of what we use to for subsistence. An army is a satisfier for protection. It's not that we need an army. We need to be protected. So I draw from this idea, very general idea, to think about a whole group that seems to be like a society within society, the FARC in this case, or the militaries, but if you like, using Goffman's term, total institutions. So, I don't think this, don't worry, it doesn't look right, but I just want to show you, I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I tried to do here is just to put these are the 9 necessities. And each of these branches are proposals of how, in this case, the FARC looked for satisfiers or found satisfiers. Again, I'm not going to evaluate. We could evaluate if those satisfiers actually were positive or negative. That's what development economists do. It's not what I'm going to do. Finally, that's the general framework. Now, sources. The typical question among historians, right? So the different kind of sources here. All challenging, because we are talking about contemporary history, war history in a country that is still in conflict, not with FARC, but with nearly 30 different groups. It's the largest number of groups in an internal conflict in the world. So ex-members, former members of FARC and other guerrillas, militaries and military and police veterans personnel, and international brigadists. This is Rubiela. Rubiela on the left side as a guerrillera, on the right side as a reincorporated civilian. This is Yuri Renteria, 19 years old. On the left hand as a guerrillera, on the right hand as a civilian. This is Tanya Niemeyer, Also, her war name was Alexandra Nariño from the Netherlands. She joined the FARC when she was 23, and she remained in the FARC until for 10 years. You have her on the left as a guerrilla with her gun, and on the right hand with her master's degree in a Jesuitic private university. It's a magister in intercultural development and peace territorial studies. She's now carrying out a PhD in Spain. These are three former guerrilleros that I interviewed in 2017: Osvaldo, Rafael, and Zorro. Three of, let's call them collaborators, in the sense that they have helped me. And one of the ideas of the project is building an archive with them, as with the militaries. This is former director of the National Police and former vice president of the Republic, General retired Oscar Naranjo, with whom I've been also carrying out a series of interviews. It's not, I want to point out, it's not one interview, there are more life stories. Other sources, of course, are documents produced by guerrillas, not only manuals, syllabi of the courses of their school, films and photos, music and art. Here you have an example of a book of songs. And of course, security and legal records, national security, Colombian state documents in the National Archives. The US intelligence, of course, the US is always there. So the US intelligence at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, very rich. And then there are judiciary cases, as my friend Taras does with the witches and alchemy. So we look at records of the Special Jurisdiction of Peace, which is a special body created during the peace accords in La Habana, but also legal processes against FARC members and military personnel. Let me go now to the study very quickly. I want to talk about what would a system of the irregular war would look like. And I want to talk about cooking in the shadows and the case of the Vietnamese oven. The original Vietnamese oven appeared for the first time in 1951, 1952. And it was an invention, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, is a Hoàng Cầm stove. He was a cook. He was fighting the French. And of course, one of the problems was air raids and being bombed by the French army. So he started a series of trials and errors, experiments, and he ended up with this idea after 2 years of experimenting. You have here the cook. This is the surface, the ground. So you are in a hole, the one that you remember Jasenia and Jenny were talking about. You have to dig a hole, okay? So the cook is here, and you have the two pots here. This is here you have access to this part, which I'm going to say, let's call it for now the oven. But there is an important, there is something important about the terminology. You will see why. So what's the idea? The idea is that you produce, of course, fire. You are able to warm the pots. But what you need is not to produce smoke. Because if smoke is seen from the air, you're going to be bumped. So this is the way they did it. They made canals, very, well, like 30 centimeters of diameter canals, with somewhat I would call condensators. They work more or less like a condensator. And the idea of that was that as long as the smoke moved through the canal, the dirty part of a smoke, I don't know actually how to say it in English, it's hollín in Spanish, I'm sorry, it's going to be absorbed by the walls of the canal and what I'm calling here the condenser. So this is from above, the cook, the two condensers, the canal, another condenser, and then there is more canals, usually 2 or 3, that can be 7 meters long. If anyone would like to join me in the yard of the MPI, I draw a very, let's say, crude sketch of how it looks. I wanted to see how big it was, and it is quite big. So this is interesting because this is part of a manual. It's a manual written by the Vietnamese army, because the Vietnamese army still uses that stove. But what you see there, it doesn't matter. It's the same idea. The hole, the two pots would be one here, and sorry, 2 here. These are the holes for the pots. Then there is even some of the parameters are very well defined at this point in the manual. Of course, not before the manual was written. So they tell us that this should be no more than about 30 degrees. But what I want to point out is that all parameters are very precise here. So now it was standardized, okay? So you know how long this is, you know how deep this is, and then it says here, as I just mentioned, that I don't know if you can see here, but this is a 7. So this is a 7 meters long set of 3 canals. Okay. Want to point out that at least until I have investigated about these Vietnamese or this kind of, as I mentioned, Hoàng Cầm stoves, there is not a single mention about stones, using stones. And you remember the testimony that I read at the beginning, that these women were talking about stones. So, first of all, and that's where the terminology starts to be important, the rancha is how they call the kitchen in a camp, in a guerrilla camp. So here it is, the rancha on the left side. Yeah. And this is an oven. It's not the kind of ovens we're talking about. It's a peasant FARC's oven. It is actually part of a book published by FARC called 50 Years of the FARC in Photographs. So that means this is an old oven So that means that, of course, they used ovens before the Vietnamese stoves. Obviously. The question is, why is it that they call them ovens and not stoves? Hornos, not estufas. And I think it's because of a old ancestral tradition in cooking. What you have here is a good example. It's actually the only photographs that I have been able to find of a Vietnamese stove or oven by the FARC. You can see here what I was talking about, that it has to have certain inclination. And you can see that there is no smoke, in fact. So these are called earth ovens. And it's a technique used cooking with underground. You put things underground, you cover it, you warm them up. And these come from the age of bronze. And you can find them almost everywhere, in Hawaii, in Mexico, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina. By the way, if you go to Peru, ask for a recipe. I'm not going to talk about that recipe, but ask for a recipe made in an earth. It's one of the best recipes. Now, of course, it is an indigenous, but of course, as anything that is exotic, it's very expensive, but it's delicious. You can find it in Turkey, in Greece, in England, in Southeast Asia. You find it everywhere. I found it in the Andes. It was, in fact, part of the traditional pre-Colombian and peasant cuisine. Pre-Colombian indigenous and peasants, and this is what I'm going to mention to finish the example. It is part of a colonial legacy. Where is it that I found it? In Tolima, the epicenter of the FARC. Who did that mainly? Women. The recipe is called cocido enterrado. So earthed food. So what I think is that we have some local innovations. In this case, are the stones. But the stones come from two traditions. One using mainly ovens, not stoves. One was colonial bakery. Colonial bakery cooks in Latin America was a kind of knowledge and practice that was transmitted by Spanish women, of course, to their servants in order not to have to cook them themselves. So it passed in the 17th and 18th century to be part of the peasants' practices. But it is interesting, piedra boba, or a dump stone, very difficult, but I found something that is very similar, and there is kind of certain type of construction in Spain, also from the medieval times, with piedra seca, which is actually used also as a technique in Latin America in colonial times. So these are at least resonates with what is happening in the FARC. It's not just that it came out of an illuminated mind It is part of a tradition. You may know a wonderful book by Chandra Mukherjee, Impossible Engineering, which is wonderful, in which she finds how women kept knowledge from the Romans to build a canal in the 18th century France, the Canal du Midi. So how is it that this, now let's forget for a minute of the innovation, and let's move back in a minute with the international part. So how is it that a stove, a cooking artifact, moved to the 1950s Vietnam, into the Andean region of a peasant guerrilla in late 1990s? I think there are two routes. One is that we know that at least 9 FARC students visited Vietnam between 1990 and 1991, according to a study by Rand Corporation, and a report of a Supper Command in Vietnam, Hanoi. But then there is another, which is, I'm not saying that it's one or the other, but I think can be a combination of both. The other one is, there is a group of Chilean internationalist brigades that were trained in Cuba. The idea was creating a guerrilla movement guerrilla group against Pinochet. But then the democracy arrived before the group was ready. So they had to, okay, what are we going to do now? So they started looking for other revolutions. So they went to Nicaragua, they went to El Salvador, and then they found the oldest guerrilla group, the FARC. So they went between 1989 and 1992, 4 internationalists. They trained FARC groups. This is and that's an interesting route, because it's Vietnam, Cuba. That relationship is quite old. This is a photograph from 1963. One of in an interview, Fidel Castro said that one of the things that he regretted the most was not having met Ho Chi Minh personally. So, Vietnam, Cuba, probably Nicaragua, but at least through Chileans arriving to the Colombian Andes. So, in summary, and here I'm going to finish now, what we have here. Let's say that one of the necessities is subsistence. You could put it in other places, but I'll use subsistence. The action is going to be cooking in the action. That's what they do. Now, to do that, and of course you're going to smell some Marxism here and Gramscian sort of. Perhaps it's the moment of saying that this is absolutely not any kind of propaganda to the FARC. And the FARC was a disgrace for our country. But then, so you have the cooking, and there you have certain special kind of production relations. It's a collective decision, but individual responsibilities. This comes from some of the interviews. There is no money involved in the FARC, within the group. There are equal rations of food in this case. And it's not that the commander eats more than the combatant, except that they have a special diets for the sick and the wounded. What is it that they have to produce these productions? Institutions, ideologies, artifacts, and knowledge. So that's more or less what we refer to as culture. So in that sense, it's not a Marxist just a Marxist model. It's Marxist, but you have culture here playing a huge role. And what you have here is, let me just sketch, institutions as organizations, schools. They have what I would call mobile educational networks. International, there is one national, then at level of blocks, and then at level of fronts. It was a true network of how to train in different things, from ideology to explosives to surviving, special forces, etc. Then there are global networks that also part of the schools. So international training is the one that I just mentioned. What kind of institutions? International networks, like the one I also just showed to you. And then what kind of, let's call them ideologies and paradigms. Of course, I know the difference between ideology and paradigm, but let's not stop there for a moment. Internationalism, it's part of the revolutionary ideology. Marxist-Leninism, and that's important because artisans are part of the 19th century utopian central actors that I think FARC inherited. Collective care, solidarity. Then I just mentioned one artifact using local materials and knowledge, which is artisan or what I call codified, institutionalized, and all of that ends up, materializes in this oven, in this Vietnamese oven. What other components of the FARC system do we have, which are going to be hopefully part of the project? Explosives, weapons, health, medicine, transportation, communication, personal equipment, what you carry, and of course, the food system. So I'll stop here, mainly only with a few final comments. First, we have here low technologies, but we know that high technologies also, but even science, are more artisanal than what we usually social studies of science and startup, what we have is more like a mangle of practice, as Andrew Pickering called it in the 1990s. So you have opportunism in context also in the construction of this of these artifacts. It's more a trial and error. So it's craftsmanship. It's not scientific of engineering. Projects based on codified experiments and theories, although there is a moment in which they are standardized. When the manuals start moving, when the experts start moving from Vietnam or from the national to the local context. So we have a tacit and codified knowledge, an institutional artisan knowledge, as Richard Sennett called them, has not a single well-known actor. We know that. The genius, but many anonymous practitioners. And here, of course, David Edgerton's work, that if we move to the technology in use, we can introduce new actors, women, peasants, etc. Rather than a network, I think that we find here is a insurgent collages. So guerrilla objects are more collages than networks. I think they are contingent driven, are fluid, are not mechanical. And there is this, I want to stress this difference between Demiurgos and geronteion. So this difference between the public worker and the manual worker that appears in Aristotle's metaphysics. So this is thinking with the hands. It's not just doing. It's that while you are doing, you are thinking, as again Sennett, but also Antonio Lafuente shows, as it's incorporated knowledge. They know how to do it. Remember the vignette, in the vignette? This is very easy. She insisted that it was very easy. She knew how to do it. The laboratories, the kind of the laboratories are workshops, are laboratories in the wild. They're unpredictable. They work in unpredictable conditions. The results are always provisional, like beta versions, and they know they are not worried about whether it's the best, but if it works, and are semi-flexible, and there is a semi-flexible authority. So let me finish with this idea that someone told me this way. For guerrillas, the night, the earth, the stones, and the trees are essential resources. After living underground in the mountains and in the jungle, the guerrilleros had to accustom to artificial light and open kitchens, making cooking artifacts to warm up food in the shadows became ingrained, part of their bodies, is a guerrilla's habitus. It became a habitus through institutionalized craftsmanship. The flag of the movement perhaps reflects the importance of teaching and learning. In the center, above the two rifles, there is a book. In all the interviews I carried out, there is a phrase that inevitably appears. FARC is the university of the people. I want to understand what it means by examining the artifacts, knowledge, institutions, and actions of national and global social history. What is this university of the people? I didn't start by thanking, but I want to take now the opportunity to thank all my MPI's colleagues, Carlos, Kathleen, Dagmar, Dora, Danyang, Rand, Sarah, and Tara, who were the closest ones. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.